Welcome on this Yoma Atzmor to everybody. Welcome to our regulars. If you're a first timer with us, then a special welcome to you. We hope you enjoy it. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am the MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, John Roskam, who we will introduce formally in a moment. Tonight's question is, has Western civilization reached its tipping point? I guess that's just some sort of minor philosophical question, but we'll get into that. The format is that David and I will chat with John for about 30 minutes and then we'll open up to questions.
Alan, you've just gone on mute. You've just muted again accidentally.
Yeah, okay. Now we're right?
Now right, yeah.
Okay, so David and I will chat with John for about 30 minutes and then we'll have questions from the audience. As I always mention, if you want to ask a question, we ask you to raise your hand electronically. And the way to do that is go into the participants icon at the bottom of the screen. There'll be a little icon in there that says raise hand, or if there isn't, there's a tick or whatever it is. Whatever you click on will get our attention and then we'll know that you want to ask a question. The chat function's available, and so you're welcome to use that. And as usual, we just ask people to keep the chat discussion to tonight's topic. Okay, since it was formed in 1943, the Institute of Public Affairs has operated as an independent, non-profit public policy think tank dedicated to preserving and strengthening the foundations of economic and political freedom. The IPA supports the free market of ideas, the free flow of capital, a limited and efficient government, evidence-based public policy, the rule of law and representative democracy. What that all means is that they view the world pretty much the same way that we do and are very vocal in challenging all the left-wing hysteria on issues such as climate change, gender fluidity, immigration and so on. They are great supporters of Israel too. John Roskam has been the Executive Director of the IPA since 2005, and before joining the IPA he taught political theory at the University of Melbourne. He was previously the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre in Canberra, has been a Senior Advisor and Chief of Staff to Federal and State Education Ministers, and was the Manager of Government and Corporate Affairs for a global mining company. John is also a very, very good friend of the AJA. John, welcome tonight and welcome to our AJA session. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Alan. Great to be with you.
Okay. John, just before we get into some questions, I wonder if you could give us a brief outline of what the IPA is all about.
Alan, you gave a wonderful summary of the work of the IPA as an organisation committed to freedom and committed to the ideals of the Judeo-Christian ethic that we'll be talking about today. Before I talk a little bit more about the IPA, I want to acknowledge the work, Alan, of you, of David, of all the members of the AJA, the voice not just for Israel, not just for the Jewish community in Australia, but the voice of what I believe are the values of mainstream Australians is so important to hear, and that's what we hear from the AJA. I also want to say hello to all of you today who I know are IPA members, who might also be members of the AJA. And before we go any further, I also do want to mention that I have been lucky enough to have the good fortune to visit Israel. My wife has visited Israel a number of times. And of course, as an Australian, you can't be in Israel for more than 5 minutes without hearing about Izzy Lieberman. And for someone such as me to know of his work, to read of his death was tragic. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to read Alan Howe's wonderful obituary in the Australian of Izzy, please do. I happen to be chatting to Alan actually just this afternoon, and a longer obituary will appear in the Australian tomorrow. And I was saying, and Alan had the good fortune to know Izzy. I didn't. I only knew of Izzy by reputation. And Alan recounted to me a story of a video that his grandchildren made on his 80th birthday. And the story was something like, Grandpa, what makes you fight? And Izzy said, because I believe in something, because fighting is what gives you spirit. It is what you strive for, and we must always fight. And he was a fighter. And actually, in preparation for today, I went to my bookshelf and pulled out a wonderful book. I don't know whether people on Zoom can see it. Let My People Go, written by my friend Sam Lipsky and Susan Rutland, about the unique role of Australia and Australians in letting people go, the Jewish people leave from Russia and the Soviet Union. And I think that leads on to a final point that I want to make about the AJA, which is the influence of the AJA in the public debate on freedom, on issues such as Australia's representation in the Middle East, on issues such as the location of our embassy, which has still not been put right and must be. We must follow the lead of the United States, on issues such as the support indirectly and sometimes more than indirectly, I think, for terrorist causes. The AJA has played a key role, and everyone participating tonight should be very aware of that and should be very proud of that. And it comes to the topic of Western civilization. And Alan and David, what is interesting for me is that culture is now first and foremost an issue for all of us in Australia and in the world. And I think for too long, we have taken and assumed the values of the Judeo-Christian ethic around freedom of religion, freedom of speech, limited government, the idea that as individuals we have rights, that we have the rule of law. All of that has been taken for granted. It has been eroded. It has been eroded as a result of the deliberate attempts of those who don't believe in freedoms to erode them. And we are now at a touchstone. I am one of those who believe that the presidential election now 4 years ago gave us hope. I am one of those who believe that the US election results last year were a disaster for our freedoms. As America, so the rest of the world follows. But I'm not prepared to give up on Western civilization as yet, because as Robert Toombs, the distinguished professor of history at the University of Cambridge, has said, Western civilization is all we have. It is what we are, and it is important to defend it, not just as an antiquarian interest, not just because Shakespeare is interesting or we like listening to Beethoven. It is because it has created our freedoms and our society, and it can regenerate, but we must understand we have a fight on our hands.
Yeah, well said, John. David, I'll hand over to you, and you can start the discussion.
Okay, well, I wish to point out that this was not a paid advertisement, some of the things that John said, but we have been collaborating with the IPA on a range of issues. And John, that's a really powerful summary. Do you think that Western civilization, our culture, is, you haven't given up, but is it weaker? Is it more vulnerable now than it has been in the last decade or two?
Oh, I would certainly agree. But Western civilization is a product of thousands of years of our history and heritage. I think one of the things that has happened, and David, I wouldn't even go back to a few decades ago. I wouldn't even go back to 1968, for example, and the tumult of Europe. I'm very influenced by what the English writer, journalist Douglas Murray has spoken about, which is our culture seems to have shifted so rapidly. It has shifted under our feet as we speak about it. It seems to me, having been at the IPA now 15 odd years, it seems to have shifted so quickly in the last 2 or 3 years. Things we took for granted around freedom of speech, the rule of law, freedom of religion, the idea that we can say and practice what we believe in without the Human Rights Commission regulating our lives and our families, has gone very, very quickly. I think there's many reasons for it. I think it's a failure of the political leadership on the Conservative side. I think Absolutely. It's a function of an assumption that we will always have Western civilization. And I'm also very influenced by what Ronald Reagan said about every generation has to fight for its own freedoms. And I think certainly not that Western civilization and the concept is weaker that at any time in, let's say, the last 500 years, but I would certainly say it's weaker than at any, and more tenuously held than at any time in the last decade. And it is under a sustained assault in a way we have not seen in our lifetimes.
Yeah, it's interesting you referenced Douglas Murray, because one of the books that I would commend to people is his book called The Strange Death of Europe.
Yes.
It's a non-PC subject which basically implies that European society is destroying itself in some way, and he points to radical Islam in particular as having a significant detrimental effect. But one thing I want to raise with you, John, is the quality of our institutions, because it's our institutions that we rely on, whether it's the quality of our politicians, having a free media that actually reports things fairly, a judiciary which is not activist, an education system that actually teaches the basics. And I know that the IPA has been active in all those areas, but do you see that there's a weakness in some of our institutions?
The left would not see it as a weakness, David. The left would see it as simply a rebalancing of the scales. And I don't necessarily see it as a weakness. I see it as a diminishing of the institutions, and it's all the institutions. It's our parliament, it's our civil service, it's religious organisations, it's business, it's the military. I think you can argue the most woke organisation in Australia today is the Australian military. And I think what has happened is that liberals, libertarians, conservatives, however you might describe a broad family that is the centre-right, have taken for granted their beliefs. They've stopped arguing them. They've stopped inculcating values into young people. And those who are more determined will usually win. It might be a war, it might be a debate, it might be a family argument. And we are against a determined opponent that I believe is deeply nihilistic. It is very easy to tear down something that has taken centuries to build. It can be torn down in a matter of days and weeks. And I think we have to understand all of our institutions have gone left. I don't like the term woke. Woke doesn't capture, I think, the essential nihilism of what we are facing, the emptiness of what we are facing. Critical race theory is a form of cultural Marxism that is a dead end for society, that divides us, doesn't unite us. And we have to understand this is across all our institutions other than very few.
John, I want to take you into a dangerous area. And we have largely a two-party system. And the party which is supposed to be the voice of centre-right conservative values has been the Liberal Party. But, I mean, there are some good people in the Liberal Party, but there are also some who, let me say, don't represent, in my view, the sort of values you're talking about. What's happened to the Liberal Party? because that's, at the end of the day, where our government might come from and make the laws, set the scene. I mean, we've seen major problems with the former Prime Minister Turnbull. We've seen in New South Wales some initiatives by the Environment Minister that would put the Green Party to shame, etc. What's your assessment of the Liberal Party now?
And David, I'm speaking as a 30-year Liberal Party member.
Okay.
I'd make a couple of comments. A lot of what you've said about the Liberal Party applies to the Labor Party as well. There was once upon a time, I used to go to meetings, not as a Labor Party member, but as an observer of an organisation called Labor Friends of Israel.
Yeah.
A lot of what's happened to the Liberals has happened to the Labor Party. I just think it's happened quicker and more obviously to the Labor Party. I think the Liberal Party has taken the base, so-called, for granted. I don't even like calling it the base. I like calling it the majority of Australians who believe in the Australian way of life. That the debate, as I mentioned, goes to the more determined. The debate also goes to that 3 or 4% of the population, or that 3 or 4% in the Labor Party or the Liberal Party, who are the loudest, who pretend to speak for others. I think the Liberal Party has forgotten the outer suburbs and the regions. I think the Liberal Party increasingly, not entirely, but speaks for an electorate and a constituency that isn't very different from the Greens. I think that the National Party, this hasn't happened to yet, and people like Bridget McKenzie or Matt Canavan, I think, understand that what's happened to the Labor Party and the Liberal Party can't happen to the National Party. And we are now pre-selecting and selecting leaders who don't understand fundamental values. And it broke my heart when our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said he's not going to fight for freedom of speech because it doesn't create a single job. Well, neither does freedom of religion. Neither does the rule of law. And I think our political parties are being hollowed out, but it simply represents the change in our institutions that we are seeing across the board.
One of the institutions that the IPA has been active in has been looking at the universities. Now, a number of our universities have Confucius centres. A number of them have Arabic and Islamic centres. When the Ramsay Foundation formed and offered centres for teaching Western civilisation, that was horrible. And they're struggling to get any acceptance. So what's going on here, John? Have the universities been lost?
Yes. The universities are in crisis. Australia's universities are in crisis. And it's not just as a result of COVID and the lack of international students. Universities no longer believe in the freedom of ideas. We surveyed students and we found something like 30 or 40% of students feel they can't express an opinion, either because of their lecturers, tutors, or because of other students. If you question the orthodoxy, you are dismissed from your position, as of course Peter Reid was. Australia's universities are broken. I'm not sure they can be fixed. I don't know whether we want them to be fixed. The future of higher education, such as it is in smaller institutions. It is in more diverse institutions. It is not in these large, monolithic, oligopolistic organisations funded by us as taxpayers that do not suffer the winds of competition, that are not responsive to their students and are not communicating values. When I taught political theory at Melbourne University, I taught Karl Marx. I taught Communist Manifesto. I think it's a key part of the Western canon that we need to understand. I also taught Machiavelli. I also taught Locke. I also taught Smith. I also taught Mill. Students are only getting a tiny fraction of the heritage that they're entitled to, which is why arts degrees are declining in enrolments. It is why students are turning away from higher education, and it is a tragedy, and it needs to be reinvigorated, but it will not be through the university system as we know it at the moment.
Okay. I'm just going to raise one last issue before handing back to Alan, and it's one that scares me, and we saw it on display dramatically during the US presidential election. That's the power of big tech to basically censor, etc. Now, you're familiar with that, but what can be done? I know there was a friend of ours, mutual friend, Senator Alex Antic,
Yes.
wanted to try to establish a parliamentary inquiry into the power of big tech. A few of our MPs have spoken out on it. What's your view, firstly, on the magnitude of this power, and secondly, is there anything that can be done at an Australian level?
Yeah, and let us make no mistake, the power of big tech is enormous. But the libertarian in me will argue, as bad as the power of big tech is, the power of big government is worse. The IPA has suffered at the hands of big tech from time to time. Conservative, right of centre voices, libertarian, liberal voices have suffered. But I think we face something potentially whereby the cure could be worse than the disease. What I want to have is more voices. I think we have to understand, firstly, that big tech is not neutral. Big tech is the voice of the progressive extreme left increasingly. Once we understand that, we can understand that government regulation is only likely to make it worse. Government regulates things in its own interests. Anything a conservative government will do, either in the US or Australia, will be weaponized by the left. What we need to do is create more platforms. We have to create as much neutrality as possible. I think if we have the ABC, which I would argue is the worst of the big tech in Australia, if we're going to have the ABC, ideally sell it, or if we're going to have the ABC supported by the government, then have Sky News supported by the government as well. I think big tech is a major problem, but I'm more concerned about what government might try and do to big tech. You don't want to let Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd loose on Facebook.
Okay, back to you, Alan.
Okay, thanks, David. John, we've spoken, or we've touched on the left, and I want to ask you about that. And I'm actually reading a book at the moment. It's the autobiography of David Horowitz, who's an American political commentator. And he was a product of the 60s, the flower power, counterculture. You know, his parents were communists. He was brought up as a communist. And it took him, I haven't finished it, but it took him into his 40s until he started realising that the left wasn't such a great ideology to hitch your wagon to. So I'm just wondering, why, with leftists, why are they so keen on socialism and communism when history has proven those systems to be a failure? Why do they like this so much?
Because they will never let evidence get in the way of emotion. I'm very influenced by George Orwell. George Orwell wrote about this. There's David Horowitz, and many of you, people with us tonight would know Dave Rubin and his podcast and how he's moved from the left to the right. What's interesting for me in Australia is people like Peter Baldwin. And for those of you who haven't yet seen it, if you were to Google, use big tech, Peter Baldwin, he's created a new website. Peter Baldwin started off on the left of the Labor Party. He has gradually come to understand what the nihilism, and I'll use that term again deliberately, of the left has stood for, and what it leads to. And I think there are people who are willing to look at evidence and debate, and there are people who will absolutely only respond to emotion. Another name that I should mention as one who's come from the left to the right is an American writer, a great demographer, who's done a lot of work in the Jewish community in the United States, Joel Kotkin. Now, Joel Kotkin is a right-wing Democrat. They are extinct in the Democratic Party, as soon right-wing Labor people will be extinct in the Labor Party. And when, if those of you, after you've stopped listening to the wonderful AJA podcasts and discussion, if you had 5 minutes, go and listen to Joel Kotkin talking to Brendan O'Neill about freedom and about Western civilization and about what it is not doing just only to the elites who can fly to Paris or Dubai or Singapore, but to the working class who have their jobs, who have their culture, who have their sport, who have their churches and their synagogues to go to, all being eroded. And it's an attack. And when we talk about an attack on Western civilization, we have to understand it's not an attack just on Western civilization. We are Western civilization. It is an attack on us. And I divide the left into two sorts. Alan, those who are willing to look at the evidence and change their minds, and those who are so invested that they cannot see the difference. I'm speaking to you as a Melburnian, as a Victorian, who was locked up for most of last year in the face of the massive failures of the Andrews government. We saw a left-wing media, a left-wing population so invested they could not see what was in front of their noses. My parents came to Australia from Europe after the war. I often think that in the late 1980s and the 1990s, no one in East Germany suddenly woke up and said to themselves, communism is a failure. We have failed the people of Eastern Europe. Communism is a disaster. They will never explain. They will never apologise. They will simply wish it away. And I think that's what a lot of the left are doing. And we have to understand that. I think on the right, we are too often wanting the left to understand and admit that socialism and communism is evil and it doesn't work. They will never, ever, ever do that. There are too many people too emotionally invested in the ideals of what communism aspires to be, but which always fails.
Is that, John, because human nature is inherently capitalistic, do you think?
Human nature is many things. I don't think human nature is innately capitalistic. I think human nature embodies a sense of fairness. I think it does embody a sense of equality. It embodies a sense of dignity. And these are all religious terms, and I'm using them deliberately. These are all gifts from God. And I think what human nature does embody is a sense of the individual and our dignity, and that is the essence of the Judeo-Christian ethic. I think capitalism is simply an expression of our desire to advance ourselves, to strive, to struggle, to fail. And for me, that's what the Bible talks about. That's what the Torah talks about. I think capitalism is a manifestation of the dignity and the worth of the human individual.
Just one more aspect from me, John, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. You've mentioned a few names, and we all know names of people that have drifted from the left to the right. You know, we'd say they woke up one day and saw where they were going. I'm not aware of any people that went the other direction, and I'm wondering if you are.
That I am not, in the same way as there aren't millions of people trying to get into North Korea.
Fair enough. Okay. All right, we'll go to questions from the audience. There's a few names up there. I've got Saul, Ron, Gary, and I think a couple of people have just put up their name. Debbie's there. So we'll start with you, Saul. Please unmute yourself, and I will just remind people again. Please just single questions, because we want to get through everybody and give everyone a chance. So, Saul, you're off first. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
The universities. I think that really it goes back to Dawkins. It's with Dawkins that the rot really began. But one thing that at least is hopeful, the Ramsay business actually had caught on in one university, the University of Wollongong, where you can do a BA in Western civilization, though there's some criticism one can have of it. You study Virgil, Homer, Dante, Goethe, but not in the original languages in any way. That's a pity. But do you think, actually, John Roskam, that we can place hope in something as small as Campion College to save the university system?
I absolutely do think that. Thank you for your question. And I have the honour of being a fellow of Campion College. I think as an outstanding liberal arts college, Campion is the future. I think the future is many different Campions of many different persuasions, of a diversity of ideas and ideals. And to come to your initial point about Dawkins, I think not only did Dawkins make Australia's universities far too big and not responsive to students, and they began destroying the student experience, what we did was we eroded the value of technical education. We eroded the value of craft. We eroded the value of working with our hands. And again, I've mentioned a number of names tonight. I'm very influenced by an English journalist and writer, David Goodhart, who talks about the domains of the hand and the heart and the head. And not universities are special organisations. They are no less valuable than an outstanding technical education. They are no less valuable and no less important than beginning a job, working for yourself, mowing a lawn, or studying Homer. And the idea that we have privileged some things above other things, and that everyone should go to university and everyone should study climate change or gender studies, I think has been a key part of the problems that we face.
Okay. Ron, your turn. Please ask your question.
While Ron's unmuting, I'll just mention that I was asked to provide a reference to Campion College in their latest successful application for funding.
Oh, good one. Okay, Ron, fire away.
Okay, hi, good evening, John. Given the fact that the European Enlightenment promoted rational thinking and reason, and yet we've gone to a point where the people that have benefited from that have actually destroyed what created them in the first place. How do we deal with that? We've got the diagnosis right, but what is the treatment? Given the fact also that big donors are feeding it with huge donations to universities. I'm talking about academia specifically.
I think that's a key question. And I say this semi-seriously and semi-humorously. You're also speaking to an Enlightenment skeptic to some extent too. Reason is absolutely important, but so is faith, so is tradition, so is the legacy of our heritage. When we speak about the Enlightenment, I always think it stops at the boundaries and the borders of Scotland and England. And I think the French Revolution is a history traced all the way to 1933 and then 1945. And I think what we are facing is exactly as you've said, and so many people have written and spoke about, the death wish of liberalism in some senses, that goes to the notion of there is no such thing as truth, there's no such thing as beauty. Everything is subjective, cultures can't be compared and ranked, and that there is no difference between a society where we live in freedom and a society there we live in slavery. And I think this, what we're facing now is we're seeing the limits to the Enlightenment project.
John, I mean, I never liked history as a kid, but I can see that by studying history, you learn what went wrong in the past and how to avoid it in the future. Are they teaching as much history as they used to?
They are, but it's a very different kind of history. It's episodic history. There's no narrative history. It's the history of human experience, which is important, but there's very little knowledge of world history. There's very little knowledge of the last 200 years of history. And it is all taught, as David alluded to, the work of the IPA looking at university subjects and also what's taught in schools, is that it is all taught through the prism of Marxism, class, race, and gender theory. The role of individuals, the role of human agency, the role of choice is eliminated, the role of enterprise is removed, the role of invention is removed. We did an analysis of the key themes of Australian history, for example, being taught in undergraduate courses around Australia. There's a lot about slavery, there's a lot about colonialism, there's a lot about women's liberation and about climate change, there's very little about democracy. There's very little about freedom. There's very little about the rule of law. Intellectual history has almost been eliminated. I did honours in economic history. Economic history as a discipline has almost been eliminated. But if you wanted to study 1 out of 30 courses on Foucault or Derrida, you could. This is what's happened to our universities.
And I'll just, before we go to Terry, I'll ask you about Generation Liberty. That's one of your programs, isn't it? Do you want to just tell us what that's about?
Generation Liberty is a program whereby the IPA has at Australian universities, and we're now in 20 universities, a student at the university who also works for the IPA, who holds events for students, who holds film nights for students, who runs book clubs for students, and it is proving hugely popular. It is now almost trendy to be a conservative on campus. And it is very interesting when we talk to students about what do they want to learn. They want to learn about the big ideas. They want difficult things to read. When we have a book club that we talk about Dostoevsky, Orwell, Jane Austen. We talk about the Brontes. We do some Shakespeare. We've done Charles Dickens. Overwhelmingly, students want to be engaged and they want to analyse the purpose of meaning and the purpose of belonging. Dostoevsky is far and away the most popular author that we offer in our book club program because students understand that there is a purpose to life and a meaningfulness to life, and they want to unpack it, and they're not getting it from universities at the moment.
Okay, Terry, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Hi. I was particularly taken by your thesis that the age of reason is past and that we don't really go on evidence anymore. That's been the case if you've been a Zionist for quite some time. I was just wondering, to me, the major problem we have in Australia is that the Liberal Party is about as useless as you can get. The only reason that Dan Andrews would be re-elected is because there's no opposition. And same is true in a number of other states and to an extent federally. If we could persuade the Liberal Party to do one thing, and that would be to remove funding from some of these so-called universities, remove it, because they don't deserve it. They're not universities if they don't support the freedom of expression and freedom of ideas being discussed. Would that not be a start in the fight?
I think that would be a very valuable start, and then we start on schools. You know, I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking to Liberals about, Nationals about, Labor Party MPs about, those who are interested, is to not be afraid of culture, to understand its importance, to understand the concept of the great Breitbart, that politics is downstream of culture, and understand the role of universities and schools. And I, having worked for the Howard government for many years, I think an outstanding government in so many ways, but the disaster of the national curriculum in schools, the not unwinding the Dawkins reforms has been very, very deleterious, and that flows through all of society. And then I'd sell the ABC after I've defunded universities.
Okay, thanks, John. Gary, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks for dropping in and talking with us all. A comment and a question, both of them pretty brief, and I really don't know if there's some linkage between them. I've read a quote from John Howard saying that a conservative is someone who doesn't think their grandparents were less moral than themselves. And I've wondered sometimes whether that resounds with the commandment of honouring your father and your mother. That's a comment, and I don't know if my question is somehow related. 1943, when the IPA was established, what prompted that? Was it anything to do with the sort of disturbing things that George Orwell was noticing in England?
I think your first comment is absolutely apposite. And in relation to the founding of the IPA, I think the 1940s, absent a tragic cataclysmic world war, are in some ways not so very different to now. A number of businessmen in Melbourne were worried about the creeping socialism. They understood that we fought a war against Nazism, and they did not want that victory to be replaced by socialism in Australia. And it's very interesting when you look at the founding documents of the IPA in 1943 as a free market organisation. Lower tax was in there, certainly smaller government was in there, but the very first issues they identified were freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, as we were just starting to see what was happening in Europe at the time. And when you look at the constitution of the IPA from 1943, it isn't very different from what it is now. It is about our culture and our values and our freedoms and the role of the individual. And interestingly, the role of the family, because the IPA understood that the family is the last bastion between the state and the individual. And the left no less wanted to destroy the family in the 1940s as the left wants to destroy the family now, because without the family, then there is no barrier between the state, the government, and the person.
Okay. I've got Maya, Debbie, and Jerkray. So Maya, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Right, John, I really enjoy what you've been saying, and I agree with most of it. However, I do believe that we are at a tipping point, and I'll give you the reasons for this. When I was at university and I studied some Marxism, the way to achieve revolution was to capture the power centers in society, which is to capture the universities, the media, the armed forces, the police, the politicians, and then you'd have the thing delivered to you on a platter. We've seen very strongly in the US and also in Australia, perhaps not as much, but it's still quite strong here, what they call the long march. So we've had people and organizations who infiltrated, they shut down voices around them, they hired like-thinking people and progressively expanded their spheres of influence in all these different organizations. It may be that there's a small minority of them who are making the most noise and are being the most heard.
I've got to ask you to get to your question.
Just to get the question.
Get the question.
So the question I have is, without an organization that is driving a response to all of this, how are we actually going to change what's going on? Is there a plan? Is there an organization? Is there coordination? Is there anything, or is it just words?
No, I hear exactly what you say, and I think I start from a few premises. Organizations once lost, institutions once lost, are very hard to regain. I think we need our own cultural institutions. They need to be created by us, organized by us, communicated by us, based on the principles of the Judeo-Christian ethic and the things we've been talking about today. The IPA recently, for example, appointed Tony Abbott as a distinguished fellow of the IPA, and this is exactly the model we will be progressing with. The idea that universities can be realigned, that we can reinstitute diversity into them, I think is a fallow thought. I think a lot of the institutions are now too far gone. The ABC, for example, cannot be saved as a state-run media organisation. We need to understand the position we are in. We need to understand that in some circumstances, in institutions, we are a minority, but we are not a minority in Australia. And an important point is that when you ask Australians, all Australians, in the capital cities, outside of the capital cities, are you proud to be Australian? They say yes. Are you proud of our history? They say yes. Do you believe in freedom of speech and freedom of religion? They say yes. Does the ABC represent your values? They say no. I think we have to understand that the institutions have been captured by 2 or 3% of a very determined population, but they do not speak for mainstream Australians. So as disappointing as the Liberal Party has been, and as I said, I speak as a Liberal Party member, and in many regards they have been disappointing, when push comes to shove, when people get a vote, they will still vote for the Australian way of life. Sadly, that isn't always then represented in government, but I have great faith in the Australian people.
John, when you say that the ABC can't be saved, I mean, if they employed a few Conservative commentators, that would be sort of an easy step to take. Or are you saying that they've got no inclination to do that?
They've got no inclination to do that. They've got no desire to reveal that, in fact, there is a huge market, as, for example, Sky News, Spectator Australia, as now Counterculture, a new podcast the IPA has started, is realising. We had a professor from the US in English, Mark Bauerlein, come to Australia as a guest of the IPA a number of years ago. And we were talking about why in so many American institutions and Ivy League institutions are there no conservatives? Is there no one teaching the heritage of Western literature? And Mark's point is that if there was to be even one, the students would knock down the doors. There would not be space in the lecture theatre. And I was very influenced by Mark's point. You cannot have one, not one, because that one will highlight the failures of the rest. And I think that's what's happening. There are, when I talk about universities, as we've spoken about tonight, I get once a week a phone call from a university lecturer or professor who shares the views of the AJA or the IPA or others, but who under no circumstances can afford to go public. And he or she will talk about how surreptitiously they will slip in a not anti-Trump comment into their lectures, a comment that says, at the very least, hey, there might be two sides to the issues of the Middle East. But so often even that is frowned upon. So I think we have all of these issues to consider.
Wow. Okay. Debbie, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Hi. Is there some way that we as individuals can push back and stand up for our freedoms and try and regain some of the freedoms that others are trying to take away?
That I think we join the AJA, we join the IPA. We express ourselves when and if we can. We put in comments into Australian articles on the website. We support the Spectator and Quadrant and the CIS and the MRC. And we understand what is happening and we communicate to our MPs. I'm not going to suggest that tonight we all start Twitter accounts, and I don't have a Twitter account, but we need to understand the power of social media. And we've talked about a few depressing, pessimistic things tonight, but I also want everyone to understand that I am optimistic for the future because people do want to share discussion about our freedoms. As difficult as big tech is, their capacity to share stories, to communicate, to engage with one another across Australia or across the world is very powerful. And we need to understand that the opponents of freedom do it better than we do. And we're going to have to start to understand some of this and do some of that ourselves.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a question from Jerkway. I hope I've pronounced that right, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Unmute yourself and ask your question. No, you're muted now. We can see you, but we can't hear you. Now, that's it.
Yep, now you can hear me.
Yeah, fire away.
My question, sorry. My name is Jirkwe. I'm a member of IPA.
Thank you.
Thank to Gideon Rosner.
Oh, I'll tell Gideon that.
Yeah, actually, I was on the Sky News last time because of Gideon. Gideon connected me with Andrew Ball. That's all. Anyway, coming back to my question. I came here 5 years ago from South Sudan. The way I was raised, the way I started in the university, everything that I came with was put at the opposite when I came in here. First, I was a Marxist when I was in the university. And then somewhere at the end of my university degrees, I changed to become more right than left. And then when I came in here, I saw a lot of African migrants, which were raised on conservative African values, being recruited and brainwashed to become a mouthpiece of the radical left of social justice warriors. My question to you is, what can we do as an IPA or other organizations like Australian Jewish associations to help make sure that the African that come in or the migrant that come in here with their conservative values are not a recruiting ground for the radical left-wing justice warriors? Thank you.
Sure, great question, and great that you could be with us tonight. And thank you for your support of the AJA and the IPA. When my parents came to Australia from Europe after the war, this was a country and it was a culture that celebrated people coming to Australia and becoming Australians, regardless of where our background was, regardless of our religion, our skin colour, whatever had happened to us. And we now have a culture that doesn't celebrate the fact we are all Australians, regardless of our background. It doesn't celebrate the fact that we are equal. And we are taking people and welcoming people into this country, but at the same time telling them Australia is a bigoted, misogynist, racist country, which it is not. And what we have to do is spread the word in all of our communities and take the opportunity to talk to people about all the things that you are talking about, because as we welcome people from all over the world, we have to understand that no matter what our differences are, we are all Australian. And I think that's one of the single most important things that on the centre right of politics, I say we as part of that centre right, we have not done and that we must do.
Yeah, what a great story. We're going to stop the questions a couple of minutes early tonight because the AJA and the conservative world lost a friend in Izzy Lieberman just a couple of days ago. And Michael Bird and I, when we were doing Nothing Left, we had Izzy on our show every week. And he was just a fabulous person, so generous with his time. So, Michael, I think you wanted to say a few words about Izzy just at this point. So please unmute yourself and fire away.
Yes, thanks a lot, Alan. You can hear me?
Yep, well, loud and clear.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say hi to my mate, John. I think the last time we met was
at Michael.
How are you?
Very,
that's
very
right.
Good. You're looking well and you look like you're flourishing.
Well, look, I have to tell you a little secret. I'm not in Melbourne at the moment. I'm in Byron Bay. So
that's why you're looking so good.
And there's no rain here. First of all, I wanted to say how lucky you are to have Gideon Rosner with you. He's doing a fantastic job. I wish we could clone him and put him at our university campuses and teach our Jewish youth leaders how to fight. That's one thing I want to say. In fact, Gideon will be with us in a few weeks' time. We're lucky to have him. I also want to say that it's a pleasure for the AJA and the IPA to have similar values and ideology. And also, as the IPA is a counter to the left-wing think tanks like, for instance, the Lowy Institute. So I hope that you continue to be a voice for conservatives.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, just before we go, I just want to say a few words on the passing of Izzy Lieberman. Many of you would have seen our promotional advertisement where Izzy was to be actually this week's guest. Unfortunately, we received notice late last week that Izzy was hospitalised, and yesterday we learned that he passed away after a long illness. But even up till recently, Izzy was still publishing opinion pieces and making his mark on Israel advocacy. We will miss his word from Jerusalem, articles that regularly arrived in our emails. Now, I have to say there's not been an Australian community or communal leader with Izzy's moral clarity or his moral courage, and he'll be hugely missed in the Jewish diaspora Israel discourse. Now, many of you have heard Izzy on Alan and my radio program, Nothing Left, each week in his regular slot from Jerusalem. And we both Alan and I looked forward to his weekly chats. Izzy was extraordinarily generous with his time for us and supported our politically conservative views, which is a rarity in our community nowadays. He also told me he admired the work of AJA. So that was great. So just finishing off, the Australian Jewish Association wishes Izzy's wife, Naomi, Romy, his son, and their other children, and the extended Lieber family a very long life. Thanks, Michael. Okay, well, we're going to come to a close now. John, I just want to thank you again for joining us. The IPA does amazing work by providing a buffer against all the leftist hype that we see, and I would recommend everybody to join you. Just tell us the website where people can find out more about you. www.ipa.org.au. Okay, so that's pretty easy. So I advise everybody to take a look at the website and get involved and join if you can. David, I'll hand back to you for the final words about next week, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, John, for a very interesting discussion. And we look forward to putting some of those sentiments into action and collaborating on future projects. Today, of course, is Yom HaZikaron, and tomorrow Yom HaAtzmaut. And I want to wish everyone a Chag Sameach. And next week sort of relates. Let me just bring up the screen share and show you what's happening next week. Okay. We have an expert on the Balfour Declaration who will tell the story about the establishment of the modern state of Israel and how it was actually opposed by some segments of the Jewish community, which is interesting. Reminds me of a lot of the issues that we have today. So Elkan Levy will join us, and we'll have a very interesting insight into the way that the modern state of Israel was established. So with that, Alan, thank you, everyone, and look forward to seeing you all next week.
Yep, and just a reminder for everybody to join, to have a look at the AJA website and join if they're not a member. You forgot the little commercial, David.
Yeah, well, you're doing such a good commercial for the IPA. I thought maybe we'd just focus on the IPA. Okay, the three things, if you haven't done these three things yet, please do. It's important to join our email list, and you can subscribe at the website jewishassociation.org.au. Because of the vagaries of social media, we need to switch people from social media into the direct emails as much as possible. Nevertheless, for daily updates, like and follow the Facebook page. And finally, if you have not yet contributed in a tangible way to AJA, please consider doing so, joining as a member or making a donation, which can also be done on the same website. Now that I've made Alan happy, he can say his final goodbyes.
Okay, thanks, David. Now, for those that are counting the Omer, last night was day 17. And on that note, we'll say bye to everybody. We look forward to joining you all again next week. John, thanks again for your time. It was wonderful to have you. And we wish all power to the IPA. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you for what the AJA does for Australia.